Dismissive avoidant. So the key summary words for dismissive avoidant: insecurity, high anxiety, wants intimacy but afraid. So they often have this deep fear of losing the independence, losing the autonomy. The trigger response is often freeze or fight or flight. That's the flight is a very common one. The flight is it's a form of dissociation from the relationship or from themselves, and it can often, avoidant partners, their tendency is to just leave, is to just either leave the relationship altogether or just literally disappear or do their own thing, and they can get busy just focusing on other things and prioritizing other things before the relationship. Chronic survival mode. So with the avoidant, because they're one of their greatest fears, because it is losing the autonomy and independence, they can see relationships as a threat to them. They can see relationships as a threat to their because deep down there's often that sense of there is the fear of intimacy, but also the fear of disappointment, betrayal. What they tend to experience as a child is that their parents, even if they were around, they didn't know how to listen to their needs and wants. So they don't expect their needs and wants to be met in a relationship. So that's why they have trouble communicating. They're not used to asking for what they want. So that's what makes them seem or come across as kind of aloof sometimes, or avoidant, is that they don't ask what they want because they don't expect those wants and needs to be met or fulfilled. And that's what happened as a child as well, is in the beginning they may have asked their parents what they needed and wanted, and then at some point, because it wasn't being met or honored, they just learned to shut down. They learned to shut down their emotions. They learn to shut down that part of them that feels the need. They basically learn to mask the vulnerability or shut down the vulnerability. And then in life as an adult, they will live a life that avoids deep vulnerability. So they're more likely to prioritize all these other things before the relationships. They're more likely to be crazy busy with their work, and they'll put work first. They'll put going to the gym first. They'll put spend time with their pets or trees first. Like, it's just, there's an avoidance of intimacy, of real intimacy. They don't trust easily. They build up walls. They're ultra independent and can be dismissive. Yeah. And so the anxious and the avoidant tend to attract each other. It's a trauma bonding dance that can happen. It's a very common one, and they trigger each other in all the right ways to prove their childhood beliefs right. And that's why it can be very addictive, toxic cycle, because both people they're in fear around love. There is this fear, and with the dismissive avoidant, there's this fear of them losing their sense of independence. There's this fear of being betrayed, not being able to trust. There's this fear of losing themselves. And then with the anxious, there's a fear of being abandoned. There's a fear of being alone. And now the dismissive actually prefers to be alone. They're quite comfortable being alone. Even in a relationship, they might need a lot of space, or they might be sensitive to another person being in the space for a long period of time, and then they suddenly need to pull away and disappear and do their own thing. And that when they do that, when they pull away, it triggers the pain of abandonment in the anxious preoccupied. And the anxious preoccupied, to heal there's that sense of abandonment, or to do what they tend to do is they'll chase, and they'll go after their partner in a more intense way, and that sense of like codependency and hypervigilance and fear may be felt by the dismissive, and then that actually triggers them to push the anxious away even further. And now what happens is, because deep down the avoidant does want intimacy and love, deep down they're just really good at hiding it. They're really good at being independent and making it seem like they don't care. When the anxious starts to finally give up, or there's been too much pain, and they're starting to be like, okay, fine, you don't actually love me, I knew you would abandon me, I'm gonna leave now, then that's when the avoidant wants having all that space and wants having that sense of I guess maintain the independence. When the anxious starts to go away, that's when they'll chase the anxious, and then the cycle repeats, and it can be very painful. Yeah, so yeah, when it comes to healing the avoidant or the anxious attachment style, it is recommended that they need to be with someone who's secure, someone who can hold space and be a solid pillar of love and understanding, compassion for them to heal themselves. And they need to be working on themselves while they're in that relationship with the secure. So because the secure will be okay with the avoidant having space, they're not going to take it personally or feel abandoned. So when the avoidant can see that the secure isn't actually going to leave them and is going to give them that space, then they feel safe. There's a sense of safety. And with the anxious, the secure doesn't need to take all that space away from the anxious. The secure is going to actually prioritize the relationship, and that's going to allow them to feel that sense of safety and security, and that sense of love. Eventually, when they get to a place where they do feel that conviction in safety and stability in the relationship, they're going to eventually put all the focus and awareness off that relationship and more on them. And it's going to be more balanced. Instead of being all about the partner and overly preoccupied, once the safety is there, then they will finally start to find that inner balance. But yeah, it's going to be a journey for either, for both, and at the same time they need to be working on themselves, because the projections can start to eat away at the secure, and that's when the relationship can disintegrate, is when the secure is coping all the trauma, like it's coping all the negative projections, or they're having to hold a lot of space, or they're having to spend more time alone than what they would actually desire, because the avoidant wants to be alone or take all that space. And then there's the pressure of they have to be able to cope with the pressures that the anxious might put on the relationship, and they need to know how to communicate in a way that supports both partners or that supports the insecure partner in healing, doing the work and loving themselves, and doing things that will be healthy for them and the nervous system. Ultimately, they need safety. The anxious and the avoidant, they really value that, having the sense of safety. So the fearful avoidant and disorganized, that's when it's a combination of both, and it's a more of a bit of this is when the anxious will be anxious when they're with someone who is avoidant, but then if they start dating someone who's anxious, they would switch to avoidant. So it's a little bit more of a complex one. Yeah. And so there's insecurity, high anxiety, sometimes wants intimacy, sometimes doesn't. The trigger response varies. Chronic survival mode. They get into push-pull dynamics they're confused about love, they downplay relationships, and they have trouble feeling emotions. Yeah, so they can be in the sometimes, yeah, people can switch between all three. That can happen. That can happen. So lastly, the secure, which is the goal, this is what those that are trying to heal insecure attachment that has been formed child trauma, they're trying to get into the secure attachment. Now, in the secure relationships, both partners trust each other. There's a level of trust, and they have a healthy view of themselves. There's self-esteem, knowing that they are worthy of love, knowing that they deserve love, believing in themselves, knowing that they're enough. They're able to speak what they want and need easily. So there's not so much fear. If the partner can't meet that need or want, they're not going to go into trauma. They're not going to go into hysterics. They're not going to go into depression. Unlike the anxious, they may go into a bit of a depression if or their sense of happiness would just fluctuate depending on how their partner is treating them or how they think their partner views them, because they're getting all the sense of worth and value from their partner. So the securely attached can attune to emotions. And that's usually because they have a sense of what they're feeling, so they can. So because they have those boundaries, they know how to set boundaries. They are in tune with how they're feeling, which means that they can make out what the other person's feeling, and then and be able to speak and ask what they want more clearly, with less confusion. There's an inner dependency. Inner dependency is when two people know that they don't need each other to survive, but they're able to they're both whole beings, whole and healthy and pretty happy in themselves, and then two people come together and then they can co-create and be interdependent rather than dependent on each other or codependent on each other. Good self-esteem. They're not triggered easily. They're not triggered easily because there's not past traumas that haven't been resolved. There aren't these like big past traumas that can be triggered and then can put them into trauma. So if triggered, they can manage emotional response. Yeah, and that's to do with communication and the ability to communicate and ask what they need, the ability to get the support that they need. And because unlike avoidance, sometimes avoidance, because they're so good at ignoring their emotions and zoning out or prioritizing other things, they're actually less likely to get the support that they really need until quite like later down the track, because the avoidant, it's not so obvious that they're in pain, and then they usually are the ones that leaves relationships. They find it easier to just walk away from relationships when it's not working out, or when it's getting really deep or real, when it's getting more vulnerable. They find it, instead of entering the real relationship dynamic where two people work things out, they're more likely to just give up before the emotions get real, before the attachment gets deeper. And that's how they, again, avoid intimacy, real intimacy. So any questions around that?